Hello, everybody. It is 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, and I would love to thank you for joining me. I realized that I was out at South Cape Beach yesterday for almost a full hour, and that was a long time, probably a little too long for some of the folks that are on this kind of internet and YouTube age. So I'm going to try to go a little bit quicker today. Today we're having a very cool presentation on how Cape Cod was formed. Cape Cod is unique in the geology of New England because of where we are and what we're actually made of. So without further ado, I'm going to get popping right away. So check that out. That is a glacier that is so big, they actually call it an ice sheet. This is the Laurentide ice sheet at its glacial maximum. That means at its biggest, 15,000 years ago, before present. There's a term that we're going to use here, BP. Now we're all familiar with BC, kind of before Common Era, and AD, after death, or before Christ and after death. BP is a new one that you're going to be introduced to, and that means before the present year. So the glacial maximum was about 15,000 years ago before right now. And you'll see that that ice sheet covered most of the northern part of the United States and all of Canada. So where we live was really super formed by these ice sheets, which carried a lot of material with them. Now we're looking at the maximum, and you have to understand that these grew. And as these ice sheets grew, they collected material in the face of them. I want you to picture this thing was about a mile thick, 5,000 feet high. And as it progressed southward, it collected rocks and minerals and gravel and sand and all that stuff and made them into big bands like fudge ripple in an ice cream. And that becomes important later, and we'll see why. Okay, so we're going to look here at a very quick image of where it was at. So 21,400 calendar years before present is that light blue. 11,400 calendar years before present is the medium blue. 7,800 calendar years before present is the dark blue. That is the recession of the plate. And if you look right over here on this side, this is where we are, right along here. Okay. This is a basic kind of formation of how the Cape looks, with a moraine and an outwash plain and all this kind of material. So we talked about how in the glacier, the retreating glacier, there were these big bands of material. What happened is in certain areas that material built up more than it built in other places. And when the glacier kind of paused, it would deposit those materials onto the seabed and build it up. And that is exactly what Cape Cod is. Cape Cod is the buildup of that material that was trapped in the glacier. And those materials are all different sizes and left behind these neat formations, kettle lakes, kettle ponds especially, which is what we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, Cape Cod is very flat, but we do have what's called a moraine, which is a built-up part of the Cape. Some of it is about 600 feet above sea level. And that's very important with some of the issues that we talk about, that we deal with today. So here's a very quick diagram of those lobes of the glacier that formed the Cape. You can see how that lobe moved back and forth and deposited those materials on the Cape. Now that's a modern map of the Cape, but that is not what the Cape looked like when that was being deposited. I have a very quick little part of a video here I'm going to show you next, which shows how that glacier paused and made the Cape. Oh, let me get to where it needs to be.
About 14,000 years ago, the glacier began to retreat again as the climate warmed. Sea level was rising fast. So much of the world's water was in the ice cap that the Atlantic Ocean was 400 feet lower than today. The area...
This is Stellwagen Bank. It's now underwater, but all this brown indicates what was once dry land. So just to imagine that at some point in time, you would have been able to walk to what is now Martha's Vineyard or Nantucket and even further.
Now known as George's Bank in the lower right, was cut off from the mainland and became a huge island for a time. The sea finally flooded George's Bank and the coastal plain. From the beginning, the coastline was being sculpted, as it always will be, by the awesome power of the North Atlantic.
And that's an important thing to understand as well, that because of the material that Cape Cod is made up of, sand and glacial till, we will constantly be open to the ravages and changes of erosion. If you were to go out to the national seashore on the arm of Cape Cod, you could walk 100 feet out into the ocean and find bricks of the houses that were there 50 or 60 years ago. Cape Cod is ever changing, ever forming, and that will continue to happen even at a greater pace as we move forward and sea level rise occurs and all that stuff. So another really cool map here is the seafloor around Cape Cod, and this is Stellwagen Bank, okay? This is literally like a skateboard ramp. Cape Cod has a couple of really neat things about it. We have the best oysters in the whole world, and that's because we have a warm water current that moves up this way and a cold water current that comes down this way. And those two things mix and create lots of plankton, which things like oysters and clams like to eat and taste really good. Okay, so a couple of really cool things that we have on the Cape. One of them is a rock known as a glacial erratic. Okay, you may have seen these big giant rocks around the Cape every once in a while. This is a rock that was in the ice of the glacier, and then when the glacier started to melt, it fell out of the glacier and dropped into the mud or the sand and has been there ever since. There's a couple of famous ones. There's Dome Rock, which is out in Eastham. You can check these out. You'll see them all over the place. They're really, really cool. As far as I know, the only other item that is this big and this dense and this heavy that naturally occurs on Cape Cod is my ex-mother-in-law. And she actually travels quite a bit, so that's kind of interesting to see. So this is what's known as a glacial erratic. Other examples of glacial remainders are things that are called kettle holes. If you drive around the Cape, every once in a while, you'll see where the land just kind of drops into like a hole in the ground, or something down south they might call a holler. That is actually the remains of a chunk of ice that fell into the ground, blop, and made a big indentation. Then the ice melted, and slowly those will fill up over time, but there are still a few left. And that leads us to a thing called a kettle pond, which is the most common kind of pond on Cape Cod. This is a pond that was created by a huge chunk of ice that fell into the ground, created the depression. Then the ice melted and it filled with water. These over time end up going through a process called succession. This is Flax Pond. The water is usually fairly clear, fairly clean, and filled with these kind of glacial rocks that you see here that also come around to the side. Oh, wait, hold on. Something a lot of people don't understand is that when we first came to Cape Cod, when people first got here, it was covered with old growth forest. This is an old growth forest from Tongass National Forest, not exactly the kind of forest we would have had here. But what I wanted to show you was the example of how it's all open and clear underneath. And the wildlife would have been a lot different. At one point in time, Cape Cod had bears and wolves and moose and all that sort of stuff. And then humans came, we started changing the landscape rather rapidly. One of the things we did was clear cut all the trees. When Europeans got here, everything was run off wood. We built our houses out of wood. We built our ships out of wood. The Navy ran on wood. We cooked our food with wood. Everything was wood, wood, wood. We literally cut down every single tree on Cape Cod. This is one of the better pictures that I could find. This is when they were building the Cape Cod Canal, and this is in the, early 1900s. So some trees have started to grow back, but you can see that there are no trees whatsoever of any size growing. The oldest our trees here on the Cape are about 200 years old. So we've always had this major impact on the environment. One of the things that I love when people describe things is how Cape Cod is pristine. That is absolutely not the case. There's a lot of discussion about salt marshes and land. We're going to talk about salt marshes next, because this is an area where we tend to think of it as very fragile and very can't touch it, can't mess with it, it's pristine, and that is absolutely not the case. I'd like to show you an example of salt marsh hay, gathering salt marsh hay. Many of you have oftentimes seen in the salt marsh these poles. This is how salt marsh was gathered and dried on the marshes. We went out there, collected it. We used horses and carts and oxen, collected this salt marsh hay. So we don't, we have this history of interacting with the salt marsh in not a very positive way. We cut grooves into it to reduce the amount of mosquitoes. So that's something to always keep in mind. Cape Cod was virtually destroyed in the first 100 years of its growth. We chopped down all the trees. We killed all the whales. We used the salt marsh as a way to feed our livestock. So this idea that everything is pristine is not always a very good one. So one of the difficulties that we have, because we are a glacially deposited place, is a thing called a sole source aquifer. Now, this isn't the greatest picture, but this is basically where our groundwater is. We have a water table that we can access, and then we have fresh groundwater underneath, and that's all surrounded by saltwater groundwater, saline groundwater, salt water, and the ocean. So we have a very limited resource when it comes to fresh water, and we've had some issues. So one of the issues that I'm going to talk about that is a big issue that came to the forefront in the town where I live in, Sandwich, is a process called eutrophication. Okay, so this is your typical kind of house septic system. Your material goes into a septic tank, has a distribution box maybe, and it has a drain field, right? And so in a nutshell, what happens is you pee and you poo, and that material goes into your septic tank along with all the material from your washing and all that sort of stuff. And the one thing that is not taken care of in the biological process is nitrogen. and the nitrogen ends up going into the groundwater and going out into the ponds, right? Or the, oh, wrong one, sorry. Didn't want to do that. Hold on, let me find a picture here. Sorry, give me 1 second. Don't know where they went. Okay, so we're going to have a talk about eutrophication at another point. Just rest assured, it's a bad thing. It kills the plants and ends up killing the wildlife that are in the ponds. It's not a good thing, and Cape Cod has to deal with this issue and figure out how to work on it. So, last thing, trying to keep this a little shorter than on my last couple of days, is this really cool tool that's out there from the NOAA process. This is a sea level rise viewer. It's from COAST, coast.noaa.gov. I recommend everybody look at it. This is a picture of the whole Cape. What I want to do is kind of zoom in just on an area that I'm familiar with, okay? It has a tool over here that shows you what happens if you end up having sea level rise. Now, they're predicting that we may have as much as 6 feet by 2100. And you can go in and just kind of adjust it foot by foot. And if you look, and you'll see certain areas become much more inundated. It's a really cool tool to look at planning. So, you know, this is now right up along 6A, right? If we go all the way up to the 6 foot, right, boom, all filled in along East Sandwich. And then there's other scenarios that happen that they tell us that we have a high scenario, by 2100, they're expecting 9 feet of fill, okay? Town Neck is essentially gone. East Sandwich is all filled in. It becomes a pretty big problem. I would highly recommend that everyone go take a look at this site and really kind of get a grip around it. It's not the easiest site to navigate. They've tried to make it better. We look at where marsh migration happens, how the marshes are affected. We look at vulnerability. The red zones are areas that are going to be deeply affected by sea level rise. And this is, again, an issue that we have because we're constant state of flux because of how Cape Cod was formed, and everything is highly susceptible to erosion. I'm glad you all joined me. Tomorrow, if the weather's good, we're going to go outside, hopefully. It's been pretty bad. If I'm not able to go outside, I'm going to put together a presentation on one of my favorite animals, the squid. So please join me again tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Same bat time, same bat channel. We're going to do something on the squid or be outside. I'll let you know in the morning when I look at the weather. I appreciate you all joining me. I hope you're all staying safe and not going too stir crazy. Have a great day.